Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 129 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's reading and commentary starts in Psalm chapter 27 and reads to Psalm 32. Bookend by two, really not necessarily my favorite, but two favored chapters out of the book of Psalms for me. Well, Psalm 27, I just recently taught through this, so I'm going to try not to end up going for 45 minutes. But it starts out, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" Is there anything else you should fear other than the Lord himself? There's nothing we should fear as believers. Any fear that we have outside of our fear of respect for the Lord should all fall to the side, because He is our great shepherd. He is the one who covers us. He is the one who protects us. He leads us with His rod and His staff, and He protects us with His staff as well. So it says, "The Lord is the defense of my life. Whom shall I dread?" If the Lord is your defender, there is nothing you should be afraid of. The Lord is also Jehovah Jireh, God provider. He's our provider. He's the one who gives us what we need. And He knows far better what we need in life than you could ever possibly know. There's things that we think we need. There's even things in our lives that we think would bring us great satisfaction. But they never even compare to what the Lord has in store for us. And when the Lord gives us what He knows we need, and when He gives us what He knows brings us true pleasure and true happiness in life, it will knock you off your feet. I know I've experienced it many times before, how what I thought that I needed was so far lower on the scale versus what God provided. And there's times that there was things I thought I had to have, and I didn't get them. And later I could see why the Lord withheld that from me. Not only was there something better, but going without what I thought I needed ended up being a much better outcome than had I have had that object. So I just want to say, we've got to trust Him each step of the way. And that's what David is doing. One of the commentators pointed out, here is David, who is a sinner. He has really committed what we would consider in the church, some people would almost say this is just beyond, we can't have this person as a member of our church committing open adultery and then having the husband of his adulterous partner murdered. Oh, yeah, no, they're not coming into the church. And you definitely would. Nobody this day and age would vote for that person to be the president of a country, would they? But it's so nice and thankful for each of us that God does not look upon us as man does. God sees what's truly inside. And God called David a man after His own heart. As the commentator pointed out, that though David was a sinner, God saw what was the innermost part of David. That David, in the end, longed to serve the Lord. And whenever David was faced with a time of difficulty, he looked to the Lord to be his salvation. And that's exactly what's happening in this psalm. In Psalm 27, I want to just read real quick how it really breaks down. The things that are included in this psalm. It's a psalm speaking of trust, trusting in the Lord, trusting in His provision, seeking God, worshiping God. And you do need to, some people will clump these two together, worshiping God and prayer. They are two distinct things. And prayer also doesn't need to be you speaking to God. It needs to be you listening to God. And I know people will say that, but nobody ever really does that. Can you pause and listen and hear what God has to say to you? And I've pointed this out a number of times recently, and I'll keep saying it probably to the day I die. People will pray long and hard when they're in a time of difficulty. But you want to find some true victory in your life. You want to find something that is beyond the pleasure that you think you could ever experience. Pray with the same fervor when there is nothing wrong in your life. When there is nothing that is negative, nothing, no bad news, when everything is just perfect. Find that same window to pray to God, to pour your heart out to God with the same passion, with the same fervor that you would have done during a time of distress. And I promise you, you will enter into a deep relationship with the Lord that you did not even know was possible. And then it speaks of obedience before the Lord. It speaks of hope in the Lord. And at last, but not least, it speaks of having patience. Can you have patience before God? This is why Psalm 27 is very, very rich. And it's part of why I recently had a 45-minute sermon on it and still felt like I was just barely scratching at the surface and not diving super deep. But you never need to fear evil when you're trusting in the Lord. And David had his enemies which were within his own kingdom. He had enemies that were without. He even had spiritual enemies that he was battling and having to deal with. And David, though, could turn to the Lord and trust in Him. He says here in verse 4 something very interesting. And if you had but one thing to ask of the Lord, what would that be? What would you ask the Lord for? You're limited to one thing. Here's what David says. One thing I have asked from the Lord, that I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, to meditate in His temple. That's the one thing he wanted, was to dwell in the temple. Now realize, David was not allowed in the tabernacle of God. David could look at it, but he couldn't enter into the holy place, much less the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest could enter into once a year. And David had that longing. It's not that God is only found in the tabernacle or the temple or in a church. It's that he wanted to be as close to the Lord as he could be. And that's what David sought. That was his passion. Maybe he thought of his mentor, Samuel. Samuel, as a young man, he had slept in the tabernacle. We believe, the best we can calculate, was that he was sleeping before the altar of incense in the holy place of God. Some even think, because of the way things are worded, he may have been sleeping in the Holy of Holies next to the Ark of the Covenant. Well, we're not certain of that, but it's some odd wording with him as a child being inside the tabernacle. And I know you would say, well, he's not supposed to be in the Holy of Holies. Well, that's true. But again, it's during the time of Judges, and the people had drifted away from God. They weren't following the Lord the way they were supposed to. When you go through Psalm 27, you'll notice that the relationship that David has in speaking of the tabernacle or the temple or the tent of meeting, you'll notice that he uses many different words to speak of the tabernacle. And you think of how a loved one, well, a husband, maybe for his wife, they have many different nicknames with each other. And it's almost like David has that for the meeting place of God. He has all these different names because of it being so dear to him and such a treasured place. And he says, for in the day of trouble, I will conceal me in his tabernacle. In the secret place of his tent, he will hide me. He will lift me up on a rock. Maybe David was thinking of when he and his fellow mighty men had fled from King Saul, and they ended up at Shiloh at the tabernacle. And he begged the priest there for some food to eat. And he was given bread from the table of showbread. And then he said, "Are there no weapons?" And the priest said, "Well, we have the sword which you took from Goliath." And David was given the sword which had come from Goliath that day. You know, maybe he was thinking of that day. Maybe he was thinking of the priest being willing to hide him away. He may have even hidden in the tabernacle for a short time. We don't really know. But as this event is happening, and we don't know if this was during the time of Absalom seeking David's life. We do believe that by the time the psalm was written, that David was already king, just because of some of the wording that's used here. But David clearly sees refuge, his refuge, being in the Lord. Who do you seek for refuge? Do you trust in the Lord to be the one who hides you? In verse 7 he says, "Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice, and be gracious to me and answer me." Are you crying out to the Lord? Are you waiting for an answer? It's why I started out saying you need to be listening as much as you're talking during your time of prayer. Some will say humorously, but it's a little accurate as well. They'll say, God gave man only one mouth, but he gave him two ears. So we're supposed to listen twice as much as we talk. Now, I can talk twice as much as I listen easily, but we definitely need to be a people that are quick to listen to the Lord and hear what He has to say to us. And if you say, "Well, I've never heard God speak to me," well, first off, a good place to start is just to be silent for a little while after your time of prayer. Another good place to start to really hear God is where He speaks the most, and that's in His holy word. He's going to speak to you if you're in His word. Well, I'm going to close out with the psalm which it has as the last psalm of the day, and that's Psalm 32. And the very beginning of it, it says, "How blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." Your sins can be covered and your transgressions forgiven if you come to Jesus. If you call upon His name and say, "Lord, I need you to be the owner of my life. I need you to cleanse me in your blood, to shelter me in your wing, to forgive me of my sins." Do you recognize that you have sin? A lot of people this time period, this day and age that we live in, have gotten to where we would say they gloss over their sins. They say, "Well, everybody else has done this. There's nothing new that I'm doing that everyone else hasn't done." Well, you're not going to be judged by everyone else's sin. You're going to be judged by your sin, and you're going to be judged by what you did with Christ. What did you do with God's Son? Have you bowed a knee to Him? Have you made Him the owner of your life? Only you can answer that question. And if you're not certain that you know Jesus, then you most likely don't. I'm going to be very pointed with that. If you stepped out into the highway and a truck hit you, but it didn't kill you, but a big truck hit you in that highway, a few days later, unless that truck hitting you affected your brain, you're going to remember getting hit by a truck. See, if you met Jesus, if you have Jesus in your life, you're going to remember. You may not remember the day or the hour. I know sometimes I've heard preachers get a little bit pointy on that. You may not remember the day or the hour. You might have even been too young to remember the day or the hour. I tell some people you might not even remember the year, the older you get. But you're going to remember that you met Jesus. I can remember. I remember when I met Jesus. I don't remember the day or the year, but I remember the circumstances to the point that I can remember the temperature of the room. I can remember the sounds around me. I can remember the hallway that I was sitting in when I met Jesus. Brothers and sisters, I hope that your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.